Nothing drives the news narrative like a good opinion poll. And in the lead up to this year's election, they've all been saying the same thing. All of them, apart from one.
The prevailing political narrative is that the Labour Party is trudging towards an electoral hiding in November. That's what the four most prominent pollsters, Digipol, Colmar Brunton, Reed Research and Roy Morgan, have been saying for months. National could govern alone, and it's John Key and Daylight in the preferred Prime Minister polling. And then there's Horizon, which began the year with this headline. As National Party pollster David Farrar demonstrated, Horizon has continued to deliver very different results to the other four polling companies. Horizon is the red line in these graphs. How so? Well, Horizon's method is different in two ways. Notably, instead of randomly calling New Zealanders at dinner time, Horizon operates an online panel in which people choose to be included. Responses are weighted afterwards to demographically conform with the overall population. This approach has not found favour with Farrar or many other commentators. But Horizon also seeks to press undecided voters on their likely voting intentions with this question.
If a New Zealand general election were held tomorrow, which party would you vote for? Which do you have a preference towards at the moment?
The other major polls generally leave out undecided responses and don't even tell us how many of those there were. And that, according to veteran commentator Keith Rankin, makes the Horizon poll a better predictor than the others. And that could mean the prevailing news narrative is, well, wrong. Really?
So the four main polls don't count undecided voters. What difference does that make exactly?
Well, they do. If you look at their websites, you can find information about undecided voters, and the two that were more forthcoming are showing figures like 10–11% undecided. But the important thing is that they are not presented in the media. So all we get is a percentage of the so-called decided vote of the parties that appear to be contenders. And as a result, we get figures like typically 55% showing for National, whereas if you included the undecided voters, you'd be getting figures in the, say, the Colmar Brunton poll as an example, something more like about 48%.
So why do you think they don't include that? Well, once it gets to our TV screens.
Partly it's like to have, the media likes to have a simple message, but it does give the impression that, say, 55% of people may be supporting National, whereas in fact it's almost certainly somewhere in the 40s or even possibly below 40%.
The other thing that came through with this is that there's also the way that Horizon gets its answers through email rather than telephone. Again, what kind of difference does this make?
Telephone polling is, in some ways, is yesterday's technology. We use our telephones differently to the way we did before. Now, in the past, it's often been said people are not always home and so on, but nevertheless, the opinion polls just before the election results have still been pretty accurate. So that element of inaccuracy has seemed fairly unimportant. But we don't use landlines as much. Our lives are different. We often use answer phones more and don't answer our phones. And so the sample is likely to be increasingly biased in telephone polling compared to previous years.
Right, and I suppose with email you can get more respondents as well.
Email, if you looked several years back, would be very biased, but email or internet polling will be becoming progressively less biased as time goes on.
You've made the point to our researcher that you're not saying that the four major polls were inaccurate, just misleading. What's the difference? Well,
misleading by just simply presenting the percentage of the decided voters. That means it's very unclear when you give a percentage what you're dividing by. You're not dividing by the number of people polled. You're just dividing by a subset, maybe 70 or 80% of the people who are polled. And the most interesting component of a political poll in election year is the undecided voters who are simply have become statistically invisible in the mainstream polls. So not only do we not see how many they are, because the real story is often whether the undecideds are going up or down. Now, in the Horizon poll after the budget, what happened was that the support for National fell by about 1.5 percentage points, and the undecideds went up by 1.5 percentage points. The others didn't change very much. on that poll. So the trend seems to be that people are moving from, or that a few people are moving from national to undecided. And that will actually show up as a rise in support for Labour. But in fact, that isn't a rise in support for Labour at all.
You sort of seem to be almost a lone voice, though, when you're pointing out and singling out the Horizon poll. Most commentators seem to see Horizon's self-selected panel as undermining its credibility. Why don't you?
Well, it isn't really a self-selected panel. You're able to join it, but it is a large panel that is... it's a fairly cost-effective form of polling by having a large group of representative panellists. Now, to cast the net widely, having an element of people wishing to join the panel is fine, but the critical thing is to make sure that that panel from which the sample is drawn is representative, and particularly that the samples that are used, and which are larger in the Horizon polls, are representative. And the most important aspect of that isn't in the other polls is that they are weighted in the Horizon poll according to the preferences in the 2008 election. Now, what we are seeing is that the four mainstream polls seem to be significantly underreporting votes for the smaller parties. Really small ones, like even for ACT, 2.5%, New Zealand First, sort of 2% figures, 2.5% figures like that. Whereas the Horizon poll has much more the look of a final election result, in that the support for the smaller parties is showing roughly similar to the support that existed at the time of the 2008 election. So it appears that they are asking more people who voted for smaller parties, and that the main polls seem to be under canvassing those people.
Just briefly, how can the uninitiated spot which polls might be a bit wonky?
Well, none of them are wonky. The presentation means that we're just not getting the whole story. And so the most critical thing is to know what is the percentage of undecideds, and we also need to know a bit more about the methods used in polling, but it's just that percentage of undecideds, which generally comes down as the election gets closer. And because of that, we see that the mainstream polls become more and more accurate the closer you get to the election. So on the poll before Election Day, for instance, I wouldn't be surprised if one of the mainstream polls turns out to be closer than the Horizon poll. However, to follow the trends of which party support is going up and down and what's happening in the undecideds, the Horizon poll is going to tell a better story from now, from the budget, for example, through to the election itself.
It's going to become an important tool. Thank you very much, Keith.
Thank you.
Before we go, a word about the plight of Fairfax, the once mighty Australasian media company that's having trouble matching the pace of change in the digital age. Fairfax shareholders have seen the value of their stock fall from $4.50 to just $1 in the past 4 years. Desperate times, it seems, call for desperate measures, and Fairfax Australia's main weekend masthead, the Sun Herald, with an eye no doubt to the company's hemorrhaging balance sheet, has hit on a novel strategy.
Good morning all, time to get into a beautiful song on this beautiful Sunday morning.
Get your free pocket-sized St John Ambulance First Aid Kit and basic first aid guide, because you never know when you're going to need it. Only with the Sun Herald this Sunday.
Next month they'll be offering free defib units and adrenaline shots. That's it for this week's show. Thanks again to Keith Rankin and to our panel, Dave Gibson, David Baldock and Leanne Pooley. And to you, thanks for watching Media 7. Russell Brown is on the mend and will be back in the chair next week. Until then, goodbye.